In January 2025, California quietly withdrew the paperwork behind the biggest electric truck mandate in American history. 8 months later, the board voted to repeal the heart of it, after 17 states led by Nebraska and the California Trucking Association dragged them into court. The rule that was supposed to force diesel off the highway is being dismantled on a schedule that runs through 2026. Nobody is holding a gun to a trucker's head anymore, and the trucks are still sitting on dealer lots. That's the part that should stop you. When the mandate died, the industry expected at least a trickle of voluntary buyers. Instead, the order book stayed flat. Roughly 3.5 million people drive trucks for a living in this country, hauling about 70% of everything that moves by land. And the ones who own their own equipment looked at the electric semi with nobody forcing their hand and said the same thing they said when they were being threatened. Not happening. The American Trucking Associations called the retreat a relief for the industry. The Owner-Operator Independent Drivers Association had been saying the same thing since the rule was written. And the manufacturers, Freightliner, Volvo, Peterbilt, Kenworth, quietly discovered the uncomfortable truth underneath all of it. Almost every electric Class 8 truck sold in this country had been sold into a mandate. Take the mandate away, and the demand went with it. Battery electric trucks still make up a rounding error of the Class 8 fleet on American roads. So the question stops being about politics. If regulators aren't the reason, what is? Talk to the people actually behind the wheel, and the same answer keeps surfacing. The men writing the timelines have never spent a night in a sleeper cab at a Love's outside Amarillo. They've never watched a load sit while a battery fills. They ran the emissions math and they ran the climate math, and they never once ran the math that a guy with one truck and a mortgage runs at his kitchen table every Sunday night. That math is the whole story. Let's go through it. And before we go through the numbers, you have to understand who we're actually talking about, because the word trucking hides something. When people picture this industry, they picture a corporate fleet. Thousands of matching tractors, a yard in Memphis, a logo on the door. That's the visible part. It isn't the bulk of it. By the federal government's own registration data, roughly 95% of trucking companies in America operate 10 trucks or fewer. A huge share of those operate exactly one. This industry runs a lot more like farming than like an airline. Thousands upon thousands of small independent operations, stitched together by brokers and load boards. That structure changes everything about this conversation. A national fleet with a finance department can buy 40 electric tractors, run them on a fixed drayage route, write off the loss, and put out a press release about sustainability leadership. The man with one Cascadia and a load of frozen chicken headed for Atlanta cannot do any of that. He has no compliance budget, no capital reserve, and no press release. When his truck is wrong, he's finished. So when a rule gets written around what a large carrier can absorb, it lands on 95% of the industry that can't absorb anything. That's the gap that produced this standoff. Now, let's go through the arithmetic, starting with range, because it breaks everything before you leave the yard. A diesel sleeper with two 150-gallon tanks will run 1,200 to 1,500 miles before it needs anything. Driver pulls into a truck stop, fills both sides in about 10 minutes, buys a coffee, gone. That number is the foundation the entire American freight system is built on. Long haul, cross country, Los Angeles to Chicago, without a serious interruption. Now open the spec sheets on the electric side. The Freightliner e-Cascadia is rated at roughly 230 miles. The Volvo VNR Electric comes in around 275. Tesla advertises the Semi at 500, which is the best figure anybody publishes. And every one of those numbers is a laboratory number. Rated range assumes flat pavement, mild temperatures, and a trailer that isn't loaded to the ceiling. Point that same truck up Cabbage Hill on Interstate 84 with a full trailer behind it, and the number falls apart. A driver used to running 600 miles before lunch is now looking at a machine that quits before he's through the first state. The cruel part is that it gets worse the harder you work the truck. Heavier freight, shorter range, which walks us directly into the wall that no engineer can design around. 80,000 pounds. That's the federal gross vehicle weight limit for a truck on an interstate highway, and it's enforced at every scale house in the country. Tractor, trailer, fuel, driver, cargo, all of it together, 80,000 pounds. Congress did carve out an exception. Electric and natural gas trucks get roughly 2,000 extra pounds to account for the drivetrain. Sounds generous until you weigh what's actually bolted to the frame. The battery packs on a Class 8 electric truck run well past 10,000 pounds. A diesel engine, transmission, and full fuel tanks weigh a fraction of that. Do the subtraction. After the exemption, the driver is still giving up thousands of pounds of billable freight on every single load. That's a pay cut welded into the chassis. And an owner-operator doesn't get a salary. He gets paid by the mile and by the load. Cutting his legal payload means more trips to move the same freight, more hours behind the wheel, more fuel or electricity, more wear, more insurance exposure, all to deliver exactly what one diesel run delivered before. The Owner-Operator Independent Drivers Association has been making this argument to regulators for years, in plain arithmetic, and it never once showed up in a press release about clean freight. Fine, you might be thinking. Shorter range, smaller loads, so you just plug in more often and eat the difference. That's where the clock kills you. Federal hours of service rules give a driver 11 hours of driving inside a 14-hour on-duty window. After that window closes, he's parked for 10 hours, whether he's finished or not. That 14-hour clock starts when the day starts, and it does not stop. It doesn't pause for traffic. It doesn't pause for a broker who's late loading. And it does not pause while a battery charges. A diesel fuel stop costs a driver 12 minutes out of that window. Charging a Class 8 battery pack costs him a chunk of the day. Megawatt charging, the industrial-grade equipment that could actually turn a semi around fast, exists. It exists at a handful of demonstration depots and port facilities. Out on Interstate 80 through Nebraska, on Interstate 40 through the Texas Panhandle, on the corridors where freight actually moves. It does not exist in any usable density, so the driver is stuck feeding a truck on hardware that was never built for a truck. Watch what that does to a real run. Ontario, California to Chicago is a 2.5-day trip in a diesel. In an electric truck, with the current range, the current chargers, and that 14-hour clock ticking through every single charging stop, that run stretches into something a shipper won't accept and a driver can't afford. And he's burning his legal hours sitting still in a parking lot watching the paycheck drain. If you're finding this useful, hit subscribe. We cover the American worker, the supply chain, and the stories the business channels skip every week. Now, the number that ends most of these conversations before they start. A used Freightliner Cascadia or a Peterbilt 579 with good bones and a rebuilt engine sells for somewhere between $60,000 and $90,000. That's the truck an independent buys. That's how a guy gets into this business. Brand new off the lot. A well-spec'd diesel sleeper runs somewhere around $180,000. Class 8 electric trucks have been landing in the $350,000 to $400,000 range, and higher depending on configuration. Sit with that. The entry price of an electric semi is roughly what a working owner-operator's house costs, and he already has a house payment. Yes, there were incentives, voucher programs, tax credits, state grants. Read who they were written for. The paperwork assumes a fleet with a compliance department and an accountant who can front the capital and wait for reimbursement. A man with one truck and a factoring company doesn't have a spare $250,000 sitting in an account waiting on a rebate check that clears in 9 months. And then February 2025 happened. Nikola, one of the loudest names in zero-emission trucking, filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. Every operator who had bought into that platform was suddenly holding equipment with a question mark, where the warranty and the service network used to be. Truckers watched that happen in real time. You don't unlearn that lesson. Which raises the thing almost nobody covers, and it might be the quietest reason of all. Resale. A diesel tractor with 1 million miles on it still sells. There's a real auction market for it. In Dallas, in Indianapolis, in Kansas City. Buyers know what a 15-liter Detroit or a Cummins X15 is worth at that mileage because there are decades of data behind it. That residual value is not a nice bonus. For a huge number of owner-operators, the truck is the retirement account. You run it, you pay it off, you sell it, you use that money. Now try to price a 7-year-old electric semi with an unknown number of charge cycles on the pack. There is no mature secondary market. There is barely any data, and the single most expensive component in the vehicle is the one that degrades with every use. On a curve nobody outside the manufacturer can verify. Replacing a Class 8 battery pack is a 6-figure proposition. So the man buying it isn't just paying triple up front. He's buying an asset that may be worth close to scrap on the back end. That flips the entire financial model of independent trucking upside down. And the banks noticed before the drivers did. Ask a lender to finance a used electric semi and watch what happens. Commercial truck lending is built on collateral a repo agent can seize, haul to auction, and turn into cash in 30 days. Nobody has written that playbook for a battery pack with unverifiable cycle history, so the financing terms come back shorter and tighter, which raises the monthly payment on a truck that already costs triple. The math compounds against the small operator at every single step. There's one more thing that never makes the brochure, and it's the one veteran drivers bring up first. When a diesel goes down, somebody can fix it. Blow a turbo outside Elko, Nevada at 11 at night, and there is a shop that can get you running. Maybe not fast, maybe not cheap, but a Cummins and a Detroit are known quantities in every town along every interstate in America. There are independent mechanics in this country who have been rebuilding the same engine families for 30 years. Parts are on a shelf somewhere within a few hours. Now put a high-voltage drive system in that same breakdown. You need a technician certified to work on 800-volt architecture, and that technician works at a dealer, and that dealer might be 400 miles away in Salt Lake. You need proprietary diagnostic software. You need a part that comes from one supplier. Meanwhile, the truck sits, the load sits, and the driver eats every hour of it. Downtime is the quiet killer in this business. A truck that isn't rolling is a truck losing money, and the entire repair ecosystem that makes diesel survivable took 70 years to build. That ecosystem does not exist for electric yet, and no amount of capital builds a nationwide bench of experienced heavy-duty high-voltage techs overnight. Then there's a problem that pure spreadsheets miss entirely, and every driver who runs north of Interstate 80 in January knows it cold. Lithium batteries hate winter. Everybody's seen it on their phone in a parking lot in February. Scale that up to a battery pack the size of a pallet stack, and the effect doesn't shrink, it compounds. Range drops hard in deep cold. Charging slows down in deep cold, because the pack has to warm itself before it will accept full power. And the heater that keeps the cab survivable at 20 below in North Dakota draws from the exact same pack that turns the wheels. A diesel driver gets cab heat as a free byproduct of an engine that's running anyway, or from a small auxiliary power unit that sips fuel all night. An electric driver is spending traction range to stay alive. Run that overnight. A driver shuts down for his mandatory 10 hours in a rest area in Montana in February. Heat, lights, refrigerator, and the pack conditioning itself against the cold, all pulling from the battery for 10 straight hours. If he's plugged in, fine. If the connection is occupied or broken or simply isn't there, he wakes up with a range figure that won't reach the next town, in a place where the next town is the only option. That specific fear, waking up stranded in the dark with a dead pack, comes up constantly among drivers who run the northern tier. It comes straight out of the arithmetic of a battery doing two jobs at once in weather that punishes it for both. Picture a load crossing the northern plains in a January storm. The diesel doesn't care. It idles through the night, it pulls through the drifts, it delivers. The electric truck watches its range shrink, its charge time stretch, and its delivery window collapse. That's not a hypothetical for a driver hauling refrigerated freight out of Fargo. That's a missed appointment and a shipper who calls somebody else next time. Which brings us to the last piece, and it's the one that would take a decade and a fortune to fix, even if everything else were solved tomorrow. There is nowhere to plug in. The diesel fueling network in this country is something we all take for granted. Pilot, Flying J, Loves, TA, independent stops on every interstate, open at 3 in the morning in the middle of Wyoming. A driver never once wonders whether the fuel will be there. Charging a Class 8 truck is not a mall parking lot problem. It's a substation problem. You need industrial-grade power delivered to a lot big enough to hold 60-foot vehicles, which means transformers, switchgear, and an interconnection agreement with the local utility. In much of the country, that interconnection queue runs years, not months. Some of the biggest truck stop operators have said publicly that the grid capacity simply isn't there yet on the corridors where it would matter. And think about the scale of what's actually being asked. A busy truck stop on Interstate 10 might turn over hundreds of trucks in a night. Electrifying that single location, at the power levels a Class 8 truck needs, draws more electricity than a small town. Multiply that by every major freight corridor in the lower 48, and you are describing a generation and transmission build-out that nobody has funded and nobody has permitted. And here is the piece almost nobody outside the industry has thought about, because you'd only know it if you'd tried to find a place to sleep at 10 at night on Interstate 95. America already has a truck parking crisis. By the federal government's own count, there is roughly 1 legal truck parking space for every 11 trucks on the road. Drivers routinely burn the last 30 or 40 minutes of their legal driving time hunting for somewhere to shut down, and when they can't find it, they end up on an off-ramp shoulder in the dark, which is exactly where trucks get hit. This has been a documented safety problem for over a decade, and it has gotten worse, not better. Now overlay electrification onto that. Every one of those already insufficient spaces would need to become a powered space, because an electric truck doesn't just need parking, it needs to be plugged in during the exact 10 hours the driver is legally required to be resting. That's the only window where charging is free of the 14-hour clock, which means the country would need to add hundreds of thousands of high-power connections at locations that are already full and already fighting local governments over expansion permits. Nobody has a plan for that. Not a funded one. The rest area outside Breezewood, Pennsylvania is not becoming a substation in this decade. So the driver stops planning routes around where the freight needs to go and starts planning them around a short list of places his truck can survive. That's a different job. That's a puzzle instead of a delivery. And there's a wrinkle in this that shippers understood immediately. Electric trucks work beautifully in one specific application: short-haul drayage, port to warehouse, fixed route, back to the same depot every night, charge on cheap overnight power. That is a real and genuinely good use case, and the trucks doing it are doing it well. The problem came when somebody looked at that narrow success and wrote a rule for the entire industry, including the long-haul dry van operator running Laredo to Detroit who lives out of his cab for 3 weeks at a stretch. Those are two different jobs that happen to use the same shaped vehicle. Now step back and look at the shape of this. In the winter of 1973 and into 1974, independent truckers shut this country down. Fuel prices, speed limits, rules written by men who had never run a load. They parked their rigs across the interstates, they blocked the turnpikes, and Washington found out very quickly what happens when the people who move the freight decide to stop. Nobody's blocking a turnpike this time. They didn't have to. They just didn't buy the truck. And that's a far more honest signal than any protest, because there's no politics left in it. The mandate is being repealed. Vermont paused enforcement of its clean truck rules through the end of 2026. Oregon backed off enforcement on recent model years. The pressure came off, and the market spoke with its wallet, and the answer was the same one: it was under threat. These drivers would take an electric truck tomorrow if the arithmetic worked. Build one that runs 1,000 miles loaded, holds its payload inside 80,000 pounds, charges in 15 minutes on a corridor that actually has chargers, works at 20 below in Bismarck, holds resale value at 7 years, and prices within reach of a man with one truck, and there'd be a line around the building. That machine isn't built yet. The people who spent their careers reading spec sheets for a living can tell the difference between a product that's ready and a product that's announced. The freight still moves tonight. Somewhere on Interstate 70 outside Denver, there's a driver with his arms folded at a fuel island, and the question was never whether he'd get with the times. The question is whether anyone writing the next rule is going to ask him first. If this made you think, drop a comment and tell me straight. Are the truckers right to hold the line? Or is this just what every new technology looks like before it works? I read them all. See you in the next one.